He also mentioned about the weaponization of the term woke, which I don't think this is something that gets discussed enough. And he questioned why anybody wouldn't want to be awake, which I think is a wonderful way of putting it. I don't understand how a term like woke has become something that is described and viewed as some big negative. Like, for me, woke is equivalent to open-minded and decent human being. If you're not woke, then that's you, but I don't know why it would be something people would mock.
I think I can answer that question. In short, it's complicated. I certainly didn't think I'd be doing this again. Last year I made the longest and most complicated video I've ever made on my channel, Star Wars: The Culture Wars Confessions of a Fan, detailing my journey as a Star Wars fan, how I started as a young wide-eyed kid enamored with the sci-fi and fantasy of it all, and how many years later I watched as the sequel trilogy kicked up the worst online firestorm I've ever seen. Explaining why it made all of us so mad, the ways the fan anger was exploited and made worse, and how all of this could have been avoided. And finally, diving into the fallout of it all with a bunch of grifter influencers who turned stoking and farming fan rage into a very lucrative business, which also made a lot of hate spread online to certain groups. In case you're wondering, no, that video is not required viewing to understand this one, but watching it later might help provide additional context. It was the most effort I'd ever put into a video at the time, but I thought it would be a one-time thing when I made it. In the following months, however, I realized that the controversy surrounding Star Wars was only part of the whole story. A significant part, certainly, but not necessarily a major part. In the past few months, I started watching and in some cases rewatching videos by people who had a similar experience to me in falling down a pipeline of hateful rhetoric, and how they got out of it. Most of those videos are several years old at this point, but only watching them after making my Star Wars video did I see them in a new light. I realized that my experience was not unique, and it wasn't unique to Star Wars fans or fans of other pop culture IPs either. I needed to take a step back and examine my journey to truly understand the issue, and explain why I was able to stop myself from falling in completely, and most importantly, what I think we should all take away from this, and at least try to make things a bit better. Because, one, if the opening clip didn't make it obvious, I realized that a lot of people who talk about this stuff, from the engagement farm to the overuse, misuse, and eventual weaponization of the word woke, simply do not understand the mindset of the people on the other side, and how they became so full of hate. And the misunderstanding is part of the reason we are in this situation. And two, the problem has gotten big enough that mainstream media is taking notice. And since I came dangerously close to being one of those people, I decided to share my perspective as someone who used to identify as a cishet white young man when most of this took place. And in case any of you are worried, no, this is not a sign of my channel becoming more political. The Mythos Archives will always be a media analysis channel first and foremost. These videos are the exception. I may make other video essays in the future, but they will mostly be focused on media analysis and occasionally fandom analysis. Another reason I'm making this video is because a lot of it is relevant to the conversations we have about our favorite stories, both past and present. And like I said, I hope sharing my experience will help clear things up. So, dear viewer, let me take you on a journey. A journey starting all the way back in the early 2010s. Back in the day, YouTube wasn't as much of a well-oiled machine as it is today. I mean, it still sucks today in a lot of ways, but it was even more freeform back then. Less commercialized, with sponsors and merch not yet being ubiquitous. Streaming services weren't dominating the conversation, and physical media was still the default. Gaming had existed for a while, but it wasn't as mainstream as it is today. It was still a relatively new medium. So of course, that means video games must cause violence. It happens with literally every new medium. It's new and unknown, so clearly it incites violence. In hindsight, I know this was just a fear-mongering tactic, whether the people who said these things actually believed what they said, but the violence narrative got big, just like it did for TV, comics, and movies before. Naturally, this made a lot of us very angry, since we were being called guilty or part of the problem just for enjoying something we loved. Studies eventually came out that disproved it, but this did not stop the fear-mongering. It just kinda faded after several years. Unfortunately, this wasn't the only thing games were getting accused of. Gamergate happened. You've all heard about it, but as a quick refresher, Aaron Ganji accused his partner Zoe Quinn of using a sexual relationship with a game reviewer for a positive review. Aaron made this accusation on his blog, then it blew up and started a mass harassment campaign against Zoe Quinn that was blatantly misogynistic in nature. This inevitably brought a lot more attention to misogyny in the games industry, and with that, Anita Sarkeesian. Another name I'm sure you've all heard of, but in case you haven't, she's a feminist who primarily speaks on the internet and sometimes at events. She critiqued pop culture media, but she's primarily known for her views on video games, mainly for criticizing their portrayal of women in various minority groups and reinforced negative stereotypes of them. Now, before I express my opinion of her, along with how it has changed over time, I am going to explain my thoughts as they were at the time. Just know that my thoughts on her have changed since then, and I'll talk about that later. On the surface, there might not seem to be anything wrong with Anita's criticisms, but she had a habit of coming across as accusatory, taking the most negative stance possible, and most notably for us today, she would call out people who hated her and use it as evidence that the gaming community was toxic and why her criticisms were needed. It allowed her a lot of press, including appearances in the mainstream news. With that, she started a series called Tropes vs. Women in Video Games, which was a massive breakdown on how women in various minority groups are portrayed in video games, and how she felt they were stereotypical, namely misogynistic, racist, and homophobic. For the gaming community, this carried a lot of the same mindset as the accusation of video games causing violence, i.e., video games are bad for people and cause bad behavior. What really set people off was how easily she would condemn a game for the most insignificant thing, like a single character animation or the option to kill an NPC. Her Twitter was even worse. I found myself checking it every couple years or so in college, and even years after Gamergate died down, she would routinely make sweeping negative statements about the gaming community, just as she did back in the day. If you want a more comprehensive look at her entire career, I recommend this video by the Gamer from Mars. It makes a number of good points, including showing a person at a Q&A Anita was on, who told her that it's better to focus on positive portrayals because focusing on negative portrayals to criticize them is only going to promote more negativity. More on this later. At the time, Anita bothered me because I just wanted to play my games in peace. I never held any racist, misogynistic, or homophobic beliefs, and it felt like Anita was making a mountain out of a molehill, and she was being taken seriously and was furthering a negative stereotype of gamers. Now here I want to take a moment to talk about the mindset that I and others had, namely that most straight cis young white men believe that things like racism, misogyny, etc. all went away a long time ago, and everyone was basically equal then. As someone who was still identifying as a straight cis white young man at the time, I can attest to that. As far as I could tell, women had equal rights, and I had never seen a black person get mistreated, so I just assumed it didn't happen anymore. Or if it was still present, it wasn't all that bad. I wasn't as up to date on LGBTQ issues either. I sort of didn't think about gay people too much at the time, assuming I would never really run into them. And any mention of gender transition or sex change made me extremely uncomfortable, and I just decided not to think about it. But any acknowledge of it was also super rare, so I just pushed it to the back of my mind. Boy oh boy, times have sure changed since then. So when I saw Anita complaining about the smallest of things and voicing negative stereotypes of gamers, and get taken seriously for it, I became very frustrated. I wasn't watching YouTube as fervently as I do now, but I was still watching it a lot. So of course, I watched as the community responded and proceeded to rip Anita's arguments apart. And she wasn't the only one. Other feminists and people who fought against racism started going viral, especially those that seemed like they were overreacting to something. At the time, we called these people SJWs, which stands for Social Justice Warrior, and it basically meant anyone who overreacted to almost anything in the name of combating systemic issues, especially in an overtly hostile way. That being hostile towards the viewers, whether or not they held any sexist or racist beliefs, or think that they did. This coincided with the stereotype of political correctness. I want to specify here that I never excused the harassment and threats Anita and others received here. Threatening people on the internet makes you far worse than the people you are accusing. In other words, doing so is never okay. One last point I'd like to touch on before I move on is when Anita Sarkeesian was brought up by my college professor. There was one moment during a lecture when my professor had mentioned her in class and portrayed her like she was nothing but a victim who dared call out the sexist gaming culture. I went to her in office hours and tried to make a case that this was misrepresenting what actually happened. I didn't have as much self-confidence at the time, especially when it came to people with authority over me, like my professors, and I wasn't as good at explaining myself back then, so it went poorly. That being said, though, I didn't like that my professor, someone who I was supposed to see as intelligent and understanding of how the world works, felt like she was trying to excuse all of Anita's more extreme actions. I did manage to be reasonable enough that I never came remotely close to getting reprimanded for this, but I still left that room feeling deeply unsatisfied. There is one thought I neglected to mention in this conversation, but I'll get to that later. I didn't give much thought to this afterwards, but a few months before this went down, The Last Jedi came out, and now we've caught up to my Star Wars video. In case you haven't seen it, I'll recap it briefly. The Force Awakens got some positive reception when it came out, then Rogue One came out the next year and was received somewhat positively, then The Last Jedi came out the year after that. There were a lot of reasons people disliked that movie, which I detailed last time, but what's most important for us today, looking at it and The Force Awakens with the benefit of hindsight, the problems are as follows. Rey is able to use a lightsaber without any training and is able to fight Kylo Ren, a trained Force user, in defeat, or at least match him in multiple fights without any training, which contradicts how the light versus dark and Jedi versus Sith dynamic had been portrayed in previous movies and shows. There, Force users, and light side Force users especially, need to train for a very long time to fight more powerful opponents, especially dark side users who gain power very quickly, but ultimately come up short against a Jedi that remains true to the light for the entirety of their training. 2. Legacy characters getting unceremonious ends in a timeline that did not demonstrate their actions having any lasting impact. Han dying like he did was disappointing, but Luke was what really set people off. He tries to kill his apprentice when he senses a hint of the dark side in him, whereas before he kept faith in his father when no one else did, even Obi-Wan and Yoda, who never gave up. And then he just dies. This set off lots of people, but after that, tons and tons of articles came out declaring the angry fans as man-babies and called them sexist, called them wrong for saying Rey is a Mary Sue, saying that Kelly Marie Tran leaving social media as proof that The Last Jedi hate is just racism, and all this left me in a very frustrated state regarding social issues. I still believe that racism was bad, and after George Floyd was killed, I saw how much of a problem it was and still is. I understood to a point that women were still treated bad by society, I just couldn't see it, and I believed that supporting gay rights was the right thing. But I also thought that Anita Sarkeesian and The Last Jedi were worthy of criticism and ran the risk of turning people against legitimately good causes. So when I saw Captain Marvel, Doctor Who, Masters of the Universe Revelation, etc., all stirring up controversy for similar reasons, I became more frustrated, because I saw what they were doing as counterintuitive. They preached their causes, but they did some really drastic things with the lore of their respective franchises that alienated their fan bases. Okay, Captain Marvel didn't, it was much more Brie Larson's statements causing The Last Jedi backlash to latch onto the MCU after the fact, but my point still stands. And as a result, they were unnecessarily galvanizing their own opposition, and no one noticed that. I was in a lot of progressive YouTube spaces at the time, and none of them seemed to understand what was going on around all these pop culture franchises. Even when they would talk about them, all they ever seemed to say was, "Media has always been political. Get over it, you bigots." Around this time, every few months, some new entry in a big franchise or Disney remake would anger existing fans, and I became more and more frustrated. Then I discovered some channels who did seem to get it. They seemed to build a lot of their content around commentating on these franchises and the disrespect shown to fans by the creators of them and the media at large. When I started watching their videos, it felt cathartic. These were people who cared about the franchises in question and understood that they were being appropriated and used by creatives who didn't care about them like the fans did, or at least that's how it looked at the time. They also claimed that this was part of a woke social justice political agenda, and at the time, I believed them, but only insofar as the creatives in question were misguided progressives who were unintentionally turning people against them. Then, on top of all that, there were also tons of statements from Kathleen Kennedy, president of Lucasfilm, and she went on and on about strong women working at the company, but there were also press releases that showed her fault, like how she forgot about the EU after she was the one who got rid of it. There was another one about Marsha Lucas saying that Kathleen Kennedy doesn't get it. But there was also one more, where she announced a female-centric series later known as The Acolyte. And so, those same YouTubers I mentioned before claimed that this was all part of a feminist agenda, and she is prepared to sacrifice the quality of the story and the legacy of the previous films to do so. That may sound ridiculous to you, and I explain it more in my Star Wars video, but if we just look at what happened, it is possible to draw a logical connection. What happened in the sequel trilogy? Main characters' achievements were basically reset from get-go, the Empire just came back in a different form, and the Jedi were nearly wiped out yet again. Rey broke pre-established rules around power escalation and the dynamic between light and dark Force users for seemingly no reason other than to make her look awesome. Luke had all of his achievements stripped away from him. He loses his hope for the future and faith in his family, which were defining traits of his character in the original trilogy. The Jedi texts and Jedi legacy he spent so long protecting and rebuilding are destroyed, and then he just dies. As a bit of a side note, I've seen several people claim that The Last Jedi is actually great and does not deserve all the fan hate because it's the only part of the trilogy that had the courtesy to be different and try new things, while the other two movies and most of the Star Wars projects we've gotten since then have been far too safe, too samey, and too reliant on the connection to the existing timeline, kind of like the MCU right about now. The argument being that it gave them what they wanted, and the current state of the franchise is their fault for not liking The Last Jedi, for being new. So Disney has been making everything too safe now because of it. But this argument assumes a false binary of the same and different. You can have sequels take place in the same world and not make radical choices that tear the fanbase apart while doing something new. The Legend of Korra is a perfect example of this. Recognizably the same world, with several returning characters, but most of the story is about new conflicts that are only tangentially connected to the original series. The characters we know have changed since we last saw them, but not to the point of being unrecognizable. There's a lot of other examples, in fact this applies to most good sequels, but you get the picture. I was going to end the argument there, but then I watched this video by the book guy where he explained the difference between literary fiction and genre fiction. The former prioritizes artistic value above commercial appeal, and the latter is the opposite. Star Wars was created as genre fiction, and The Last Jedi is a lot closer to the literary fiction side of things. A person who enjoys one can certainly enjoy the other, but if you take an audience of people who are expecting to enjoy genre fiction and give them literary fiction instead, don't be surprised when a bunch of them are disappointed and or angry. It's not just that it was different. The creative intention is fundamentally incompatible. The point I'm getting at is this. Neither one is objectively better than the other. If you like or dislike one or both, that is completely fine. Your tastes are your own, your opinion is valid, and no one has the right to tell you otherwise. What you shouldn't do is take your opinion way too far, acting like you know what's best for the franchise, and saying that The Last Jedi haters are ruining the franchise by daring to dislike a movie that you think is objectively good, subversive, and bold. Or on the other side of things, saying it's the worst movie ever made, and that it ruined their childhood, and that Ruin Johnson should suffer. Both of those takes are ridiculous, stupid, and snobbish. In fact, the blame should really be placed on Disney for not being able to find a happy medium where a new story can be told without having to adhere to or defy existing lore and established character dynamics. Then more press releases came out from John Boyega and Daisy Ridley, revealing how there was no plan for the sequels. And then the Rage Engagement YouTubers just moved on to other things like Captain Marvel when Brie Larson said playing the character was her form of activism. Then a bunch of people with a bunch of other IPs started making questionable decisions, like Doctor Who, which erased the entire story of the Time Lords with an episode called The Timeless Child. Yes, I know Doctor Who has retconned its continuity before, but none of those stoked hate enough to spread to my circles, yet The Timeless Child did. or how Masters of the Universe Revelation killed He-Man, the main character, in the first episode, and the focus was put on this female character named Teela. Then the media spoke again and decried fans as sexist and racist all over again every single time. Then the YouTubers responded and the rage continued. It's like the people handling the franchises and the media noticed the trend and were actively leaning into it for engagement. What started with Star Wars had basically turned into a controversy farm for the industry, the media, and the rage tubers. The industry and the media were basically giving the rage bait YouTubers ammo on a silver platter. This was also when the word woke started getting used more, and woke basically became synonymous with trashing the legacy of beloved franchises in the name of diversity. Unlike other people who made these types of videos about falling down the pipeline, I never really fell in completely, but I did regrettably dip my toes in with some YouTubers I'm ashamed to admit I followed the work of unironically. Midnight's Edge, Clownfish TV, Overlord DVD, No Bullshit, Yellow Flash 2, Geeks and Gamers was a channel I followed for a brief time. I even watched a video by The Critical Drinker about how canon actually matters and felt validated by it. To be fair, they weren't as overtly bigoted at the time, at least in videos that focused on Star Wars and the like. They only talked about how badly the legacy characters and the fans who liked them were treated. I believed them when they said that these creatives only cared about pushing an agenda and were prepared to ruin IPs if that's what it took. But as time went on and they ran out of these sorts of topics to make videos about, I started to see them for what they really were. I saw them rail against any mention of a character being gay or racist policing being acknowledged. This confirmed for me at the time that they were really just bigots who were taking advantage of the situation. And upon realizing this, I started feeling alone. I felt like I was one of the only people on YouTube who both disliked The Last Jedi and believed in equal rights. I started feeling alienated when I watched YouTube and came across any mention of Star Wars. This may sound absurd now, but that's what it seemed like at the time, with the algorithm always promoting the most extreme takes. But around this time, something changed. Realizing the grifters for what they are was one major factor that pulled me out of the pipeline. The other major factor was discovering two LGBTQ YouTubers who believed in social justice causes, but weren't overtly hostile or willing to condemn the slightest thing in an instant. These creators were Cat Black and Council of Geeks. I discovered Cat Black years ago thanks to a video called Black Trans Woman Redesigned Safe Space and Snowflake. If you're not aware, Safe Space and Snowflake are two characters created as a part of a Marvel Comics series called The New Warriors, and one of them is non-binary. At the time, they were criticized across the board by everyone, and Cat Black's video validated my thoughts at the time. But she was also my first exposure to the transgender community, outside of the mention of a gender transition or sex change getting brought up in a documentary or news story. I watched a few of her videos after that and learned a thing or two about trans issues. Council of Geeks, meanwhile, I had seen a few times before and had heard them talk about being non-binary, but then I came across an old video of theirs called Stop Complaining About Wokeness in Entertainment. This video wasn't whiny or preachy or hostile. It was calm, reasonable, and logically thought through. It was also the first time that the importance of representation was actually explained to me in any capacity. Most other progressives I had seen since then just said it was important and expected everyone else to get with them. Shortly after this, I started watching more videos by Samantha Lux and Jamie Dodger, who taught me a lot about transitioning as a trans woman and a trans man, respectively, as well as other trans issues. Then, sometime after this, I started learning about asexuality and started thinking that I might be asexual. So I started doing some research and looked for personal experiences people had had about their own asexuality, and one of the first places I looked was on Council of Geeks. And sure enough, Vera had done a video on it. And with that knowledge in mind, and after some self-reflection and research, I realized that I definitely was asexual and demi-romantic on top of that. A few months later, I started questioning my gender, and here I am now. I've been an HRT for just over a year, and have been considering surgery. When I left college, I knew I wanted to make a booktube channel, since my gaming channel did not seem to be working out. This was after I finished The Wheel of Time, and as I was making my way through the last Percy Jackson universe, or Riordanverse as the fans call it, series. And I had my first experience with representation when I found out that Reina Avila Ramirez Arellano, a character introduced in the Heroes of Olympus, was written as asexual. This is only directly mentioned outside of the story, but actually reading the books, especially The Tyrant's Tomb, Rick's intentions were clear to me. I've talked about Reina before in this channel, about how validated it felt to see this aspect of my identity even acknowledged by an author who impacted my childhood so much, especially following the betrayal I felt shortly beforehand by a certain other author who must not be named. If you know, you know. During all this, I was aggressively following any news around the Wheel of Time show as it was getting made. And then it got revealed that some of the main characters who had been portrayed as white previously were going to be portrayed by black actors. This set off a lot of discourse in the Wheel of Time community on YouTube, but the biggest voices by those who actually care about the story spoke up and said skin color doesn't matter. And of course, when the show actually came out, people who complained about the show did so about other aspects of it. The thing is, because of all the pop culture franchises I had seen seized by people who didn't care about them and were fundamentally altered away from the original intent for the purpose of progressivism in a way that galvanized fan rage, thus pushing people towards toxic spaces I mentioned before, I legitimately thought they were going to change who the Dragon Reborn was for the show. Let me explain. The story of the Wheel of Time is, amongst many other things, the story of the Dragon Reborn, a hero who reincarnates through the ages to fight an evil god simply called the Dark One. Think the Avatar, but with much more time between reincarnation and with a much more specific cosmic duty. In the books, it's obvious who this is very early on, but in the show, they decided to keep it ambiguous for most of Season 1. I was holding my breath for another great fan controversy until Episode 7 aired, which confirmed that no, the identity of the Dragon Reborn was not going to be changed for the show. Then, a couple years later, after I started my channel, the same thing happened with the Percy Jackson show casting. When I saw who was cast to play Annabeth, I instantly thought, here we go again, and I went from excited to worried that this would be the same type of fandom controversy as the Wheel of Time. And unfortunately, I was completely right for the most part. I even went back to watch Daniel Green and Matt Hatch's video on the Wheel of Time casting controversy, and it felt like deja vu. Fortunately, Rick noticed what was happening and stood up for Leah, which helped everyone calm down. But this was after I started my channel, and if you remember, I made my own video defending Leah. That video is terribly made by my current standards, and I've considered privating it as a result, but I still stand by almost everything I said in it. But as I made it, I did so in an attempt to show restraint. I specifically wanted to avoid accusing people of being racist if they didn't like it, and instead telling them that the casting was probably for the best. I was trying to win over people who might have fallen into the same rabbit hole of toxicity as me. Not because I had anything against diversity in the media I love, but because I was all too aware of choices getting made in the name of diversity that end up pissing fans off and counterintuitively turning people against diversity. In retrospect, I realized that implicit bias was also a major factor, like Rick pointed out in his statement on the casting. Fortunately, also like Wheel of Time, when the show actually came out, the acting was good, and people who criticized the adaptation, including myself, did so for other reasons. And in the years since the last major diversity controversy that made the news, all this seems to have died down. I no longer see major franchises with new entries like The Last Jedi or Masters of the Universe Revelation that made extreme decisions in the name of diversity, and the media dogpiling fans who criticize the new thing and calling them bigots. It does still happen on occasion, like with the first season of Rings of Power, but never to the same level of mainstream recognition that it did before. Then The Acolyte came out, and the actors started talking about the hate the show was getting, and it got canceled, and the media started talking about it. I saw so much of the same old misunderstanding I was frustrated by back in the day, and I really wanted to make my Star Wars video ASAP. Then there was a massive wave of hateful comments in social media, then the mainstream media addressed that, and I realized that falling down a rabbit hole of hateful rhetoric was much more common than I thought, and I needed to share my experience in hopes of explaining it from the perspective of someone who almost fell in. That doesn't mean the issue of the industry rage farming has gone away though. The Acolyte, from when it was announced in mysterious fashion all the way up to its release, did garner a similar level of fan hate as some of the media I've talked about. Not as much as The Last Jedi, but enough that it was acknowledged by the mainstream media and the actors. The difference this time being that the show itself was not kicking up that much controversy. The hate against it primarily came from disgruntled former fans, who were already high in the rage engagement, no doubt galvanized by the previous controversy and media backlash as well as the rage-bait engagement farm of influencers. So instead of the show kicking up new controversy, the old one just latched onto it. This whole thing does seem to be dying, but the anti-woke influencers are still here and their audience is still watching them. So what do we do? Good question! To answer it, I believe we need to ask a different question that very few others have even acknowledged, and that question is the title of this video. Why are the woke so hated? That word has been so overused and misused that no one really agrees on what it actually means. But usually when it's used as a criticism, in my experience at least, it means socially progressive in a way that is actively hostile to the majority group. In the case of fiction, prioritizing the glorification of the marginalized group above the quality of the story and the integrity of the lore, and possibly putting down previously loved straight cis white male heroes. To those on the other side, that may seem like they are getting angry at nothing, but we need to remember that unless you're on the receiving end of it, oppression is often invisible, unless it's very blatant. This is why bigots dog whistle after all. Talk to any binary transgender person who passes as their preferred gender, and they will give you more insight into how differently men and women are treated than almost anyone else. And I speak from experience when I say that this applies to a lot more than just gender. If you're a young, straight, cis white man, even if your friends or family who are part of a marginalized group tell you about the discrimination they suffer, you probably don't fully understand how bad it is. So when you see someone acting like this...
Feminists do not want you to lose custody of your children. The assumption that women are naturally better caregivers is part of patriarchy.
It sets a bad view of the cause in your mind. Or if you watched a movie that you happened not to like, or you saw a TV show take a turn that you happened not to like, and you see an article like this, again, it sets a bad view of the cause in your mind. Or more recently, if you see a character or universe you like get fundamentally altered in the name of progressivism, it probably makes you angry, especially if it's paired with the media claiming that disliking it is inherently bigoted. Now, I'll get to the effects of the algorithm on all of this later, but for now, I'd like to share my actual honest thoughts about Anita Sarkeesian. With the benefit of hindsight and actually checking out what she said in her videos in preparation for this video, I actually found myself agreeing with most of the points she was trying to make, but I'm also not a fan of the way she delivered those points. Even today, let me preface everything I'm about to say with the assertion that this video is not a condemnation of Anita Sarkeesian or any of her supporters. But for reasons that I'll explain, I personally disagree with how she went about doing what she did. She would say things like, the problem is not simply with using a damsel in distress trope, it's with how universal the trope is, or that you can still enjoy a piece of media despite being critical of it, or that seeing female characters get killed on screen doesn't necessarily turn someone into a violent misogynist. It's the ubiquity of it that influences social perceptions. She even talks about how men aren't given spaces to properly express themselves emotionally. These are all very valid takes, many of which I agree wholeheartedly with. I understand what she was going for. At least, I do now. And that's the problem. Anita's overall goal and claims are crystal clear to me after becoming an adult, and more importantly, after living as a member of multiple marginalized groups, those being asexual people and trans people. I understand how it feels to be reduced to a stereotype, and how the media can perpetuate stereotypes. Insert Emilia Perez joke here. But this wasn't always the case. That's why video essays take the time to explain things, to make sure everyone is on the same page, no matter what pre-existing knowledge they have, if any. But back when I first discovered her, it felt like she was making a mountain out of a molehill. This got compounded by the fact that she didn't use any positive examples in her videos. At least at first. So it looked like she was complaining about next to nothing and getting taken seriously for it. Later on in the series, she started using one or two positive examples to prove a point, but even then they weren't always good examples. Like in the Lady's Sidekick video when she uses cases like The Last Guardian, when that's a game that was clearly entirely built around the player's dynamic with Trico, something that isn't feasible for every game, especially those that only have a sidekick character for smaller gameplay sections. On top of that, there are also numerous cases where she claimed something that was a bit of a stretch at best, like how the presence of fridged characters makes the experience all about toxic masculinity and domination, even in the case of games with next to no story. Or infamously, when she argued that the option to kill a female character in Hitman promotes or trivializes violence against women, when it's an option on male NPC characters too, and it's something the game penalizes you for, or times when she seemed straight up nitpicking. Like when she argued that Zelda got captured right after changing into her usual outfit, a more feminine presentation in Ocarina of Time exemplified the idea that women are seen as less than. Or when she argued that something as minuscule and inconsequential as the sitting animations of the female guardian characters in Destiny, something you might not even see if you're playing the game, promoted negative feminine stereotypes. Which goes hand in hand with that infamous quote about how everything is problematic when you get right down to it. All of this feels like nitpicking and getting easily offended at the smallest of things, and then blowing those up to the level of big societal issues. Anita Sarkeesian, though well-intentioned and had many good points to make, in my opinion, did not properly explain to her audience the ideas she was expecting them to comprehend. There were also cases where something she said was clearly her opinion and not necessarily representative of the experiences of female gamers, like in the same video why Elizabeth and Ellie did not meet her standards of characterization. Though looking at that infamous quote of hers, "Everything is sexist, racist, and homophobic and you need to point it all out," I can kinda understand where she's coming from now. If you look at it the right way, it's possible for someone to find just about any work of art offensive for one reason or another, and if Anita wants to see the world that way, then she is free to do so. But that is just one interpretation from one feminist's perspective. Some other women, even other feminists, may disagree. It's impossible to please everyone after all. I do feel the need to reiterate here that my problem is not the points Anita was trying to make. It lies in how they were delivered. In one of her earlier videos, she says that men aren't given healthy ways to process their emotions, which, like I said, is an important issue, but she doesn't use any counterexamples or ways that men could process their emotions better, and without that, her criticism is just a criticism, and I like to think there is a better way. Believe me, after seeing stereotypes of trans people as portrayed by the mainstream media, I wish that we could just be seen as normal. But when I explain the trans and aro-ace experiences to people, there are principles that I stick to. 1. If something can be interpreted as problematic, I do my best to give an even-handed take, giving the pros and cons. 2. If someone says or does something problematic, I always give them the benefit of the doubt, since by the nature of stereotypes, it's unlikely to have been done with malicious intent. 3. If something is blatantly problematic, I take a moment to explain why. The internet changes a lot of the dynamics of conversation when you say something to a large number of people who don't have to show their face. People from all over the world at that. I'm aware of how things can unintentionally come across as hostile on the internet, and that is not my saying that Anita's way is the wrong way to do it and my way is the right way. All I want to do here is explain the reasoning why I have the approach that I do, as informed by my experience growing up in the age of the internet. Editing Mythos here. I realized I forgot to explain something. Earlier in the video, I brought up Anita pointing to haters as evidence that her criticism was needed. And on her Twitter, she has a lot of tweets slamming and mocking her haters, and personally, I find this inadvisable. First and foremost, as any average internet user will tell you, hate usually comes from a vocal minority that do not necessarily represent the majority. This was even brought up to Anita in that clip from the Gamer from Mars's video that I mentioned before. Yet Anita does not seem to get this, which bothers me for another reason. In a recent video I made about J.K. Rowling's comments on International Asexuality Day, I talked about an online flame war I accidentally started that got one of the involved parties banned. Now, in the video, I used it as an example of how illogical fanaticism can be, especially for popular online creators, but there is another lesson I learned from that experience. Either of the creators in the flame war could have stopped the drama at any point. They had numerous opportunities to do so, and even points at which they did seemingly make up, and then one of them just started it up again. And they were acting like man-children the whole time, and this actively perpetuated the drama and made it worse, which resulted in one of the online creators getting harassed and banned. What I learned from that experience is that when dealing with online drama, it's best to just avoid it and de-escalate it when it does happen. And Anita does the opposite of this, which galvanizes her haters. I've seen people ask why Anita got so much hate for just surface-level feminism in the first place, and I believe it happened for a few reasons, one of which I already addressed, being that I don't think she explained it in a way that the average internet user who isn't already familiar with misrepresentations of underrepresented groups can understand, or someone who isn't already familiar with the importance of representation and how it can affect our perceptions of underrepresented groups. But there are other reasons, and the way she talks about her haters is one of them. In my opinion, had she taken the time to properly explain the feminist ideas she was discussing in a way that people new to feminism could understand, or demonstrated more restraint and not coming across as so nitpicky, or demonstrated even-handedness and supplemented her negative examples with more positive ones from the beginning, people might have been more receptive and less offended. Because people on the outside don't see oppression, if you see someone going off the rails, it's easy to believe that they're just exaggerating. This, I believe, is the reason for the cognitive dissonance between Anita's supporters and her detractors, and by extension, me and my professor during our conversation, years before I even considered the possibility that I might not be straight or cis. Which brings me to my final point and the thing I neglected to mention in my conversation with my professor about Anita Sarkeesian. That overzealous activism, and hers in particular, ran the risk of galvanizing its own opposition, making potential allies into enemies. This sort of thing was all over the culture war I discussed in my last video on this topic. Uninformed audience member sees an activist who claims to be fighting for a good cause and is calling out supposed bigotry that the audience member doesn't understand or flat out disagrees with, or just feels the activist is being too extreme, so they get angry at and join the opposition to the activist, which can lead them down a dark path. In my opinion, what Anita did was make feminism come across as nitpicky and accusatory, similar to the SJW freakouts that used to be popular on YouTube. And what the feminist filmmakers in my last video on this topic did was make feminism and progressive ideas in general seem like they were going to ruin beloved franchises, and the filmmakers would call fans bigoted when they criticized it. In both cases, the audience gets angry at the progressive and joins the opposition to them, which can lead them down a dark path. But how responsible exactly is Anita, the SJW freakouts, or even the filmmakers I discussed in my Star Wars video for the current state of the culture war? Honestly, none of them are the prime suspect for the bullshit that we're all in now. There are other factors, but there is one thing that all of these have in common, and that's the almighty algorithm. The algorithm promotes whatever gets the most engagement in order to maximize ad revenue, after all. And what does that better than online anger? Online drama, as I hope we're all aware, happens not necessarily because a fan base is toxic or bigoted, but because it's very big. And statistically, some of those people, a vocal minority most likely, are very loud and can make the drama seem bigger than it is. But regardless, engaging with the drama at all, especially anything expressing anger like a call-out, pours gasoline on the fire. Most of the time, it's best not to engage with online drama at all, lest you risk making it worse and having unintended consequences. Anita Sarkeesian did not seem to understand that, which is a bigger problem with her videos, because I can say with the benefit of hindsight that her videos made a lot of people angry. Also, a quick look across her personal Twitter and the Feminist Frequency Twitter has tons of callouts. Though her detractors certainly understand this, especially known scumbag Sargon of Akkad when he went to a panel Anita was on, knowing that if she noticed him, and she did, she would call him out, and he could then reap the attention and most likely ad revenue it would get him. Of course, Anita walked right into Sargon's trap. The algorithm has no sense of right and wrong, or whoever is technically correct. It only cares about whatever keeps people engaged and producing more ad revenue. So yes, like many video essays, especially those made by trans people, the overall point of this video is that capitalism is bad. All the figures I brought up here are factors in the online rise of the culture war, and not all major factors necessarily, though it's impossible to tell right now. I talked about Anita Sarkeesian, Kathleen Kennedy, and Brie Larson because they are the controversial figures that I am the most familiar with due to my experience, but there are others. While toxic content creators definitely deserve blame for the state of the culture war, they were all enabled by the algorithms of these social media platforms that people are on more and more, and that people depend on for news and information more and more. And until these platforms are run better and don't spread rage and misinformation as much, we need to understand that and act accordingly. And recently, someone actually managed to do that. Brie Larson, one of the key figures in the online culture war, when asked about angry male fans recently, completely dodged the question, saying it would tie her to something she doesn't want to be tied to, presumably because she figured out what was going on, how her statements were being used as fuel for the online culture war, and the interviewers were aware of this and were probably leaning into it. We need more people to do what she did. Be aware of what is going on and avoid fueling online rage. So with all of that established, this begs the question, what do we do about it? Well, I've actively tried to break the whiny woke SJW stereotype since it was Cat Black and Council of Geeks breaking the stereotype that helped me escape the pipeline. And we need to show people, cishet white men included, that we are not their enemy. We need to show them that we have something to offer them that's worth having. The internet promoting the most angry takes and polarizing perspectives has left us divided, but those takes did not come from nowhere. In this video, thus far, I've discussed how people uninformed can be turned against activists if the activist comes off as too extreme. But there is another common thread here from the other side. People from marginalized groups, or people who support them, expressing their anger. I want to say here that I empathize with that. When society makes it very clear they don't care what happens to you and they don't care if the bigots try to erase you from society, it justifiably makes you angry. Furious even. And if I'm being honest, a lot of recent events have made me disappointed in humanity. And we've seen over and over again that seeing someone else, even on the other side of the screen, who shares your anger, especially if it's been repressed, is validating. I've been in that position myself. I've had bouts of rage that make me want to get up and shout, amongst other things. But anecdotally, I'd say there's more than enough evidence at this point to suggest that rage-driven online call-out culture is not the solution. I know it's satisfying to see a takedown of something you hate. I know it's satisfying to see a defense of something you love. Human beings naturally gravitate towards what already agrees with them. That's how echo chambers form, and that's how polarization is created. I can tell you from personal experience that as I began seeing the rage grifters for what they are, I wanted to move towards progressive spaces, but whenever I did, I always felt anxious because I thought I would be blasted for disliking The Last Jedi, amongst the other films released around that time. The mass fan-shaming done by the media had created the impression in my head that that was the common attitude held by progressives. I believed that they were the type of people you needed to walk on eggshells around, or they would condemn you for the most minor expression of dissent. Only after I decided to just speak up anyway and be as even-handed as I could did I realize this was not the case. I realized that progressives aren't searching for offense for the most part, they're just regular people. And as such, I was able to fully embrace those communities. And in turn, they accepted me. Instead, I recommend honest communication in a way that understands its audience and can explain issues even to the most uninformed people. Even as I say that though, there's something else I need to mention, and that's men's mental health. Our society still stigmatizes acknowledging it, especially for men, since it's seen as unmanly by toxic masculine standards. If what I said about uninformed audience members didn't make it clear, we also ought to consider things from their perspective before we form judgment. Thankfully, people are starting to realize the relevance of this topic in general. I focused on Star Wars and the subsequent pop culture backlash in my previous video on this topic, and other culture war topics like Anita Sarkeesian and the diverse casting disagreements in this video, because I've been able to introspect a lot about my experience with all of them. And while they are certainly factors in the anti-woke movement, they are far from the only ones or even the most impactful, arguably. I didn't even touch on the manosphere, a bunch of older men high on toxic masculinity that preach about it to insecure young men, which causes them to fall down a dark path. And that one was big enough to get mainstream attention and to get examined in the Netflix series Adolescence, which takes a hard look at the effects of those caught in it. But if you'll indulge me for just a bit longer, I'd like to talk about my experience with gender for just a moment. I've never dove deep into the specifics of my gender identity, but I identify as bigender, which is a non-binary identity composed of two other identities. In my case, the masculine and the feminine, which is the most common one that I know of. Growing up, I never had as big of a problem with masculinity as other trans feminine folks. I never hated being a boy, and to this day, I don't get much dysphoria from being called he or him or sir or brother or son. Many of my tastes and attitudes are what you would call stereotypically masculine. but I never really liked anything that was hyper-masculine, like playing as barbarian characters in RPGs, or football, or hanging out with a bunch of older men. I also had a liking for some things that were stereotypically feminine, like what you would call pretty outfits, princesses, and of course, mermaids. Lots and lots of mermaids. I would look at certain pieces of women's clothing and then I became envious, as in I wished I could wear them, thinking the male alternatives were generic and boring. I also did dance and theater at my local art center a lot as a kid, and that's a field that was very female dominated. In the last few years, we got a new dance director who encouraged more boys to learn to dance, but for most of my time there, I was often the only, air quotes, boy, and most of the teachers were women. So of course this gave me cause to interact with them, and I came to see girls and women as people not too different from myself. This, I think, inoculated me against the worst of the pipeline. I was also aro-aspec, though I did not know it at the time, so getting a girlfriend was never really a priority for me. When I started recognizing these strange feminine tendencies I had had since I was very young, it was terrifying at first, but letting myself express a bit of femininity was also a source of joy, even if it was in secret. I also realized that I was comfortable in female-dominated spaces, outside of just the dance floor. Hence why, after cycling through a few labels, I eventually landed on bigender. I've seen other trans people, even binary trans people, with varying views of their assigned gender at birth. Sometimes they never connected with it, and sometimes they consider living under another identity a valuable experience because it gave them a different perspective. A different perspective that most people don't have. And if it wasn't obvious, I fall into the latter category. And this is why I empathize with the struggles of young men in our society who may not fit the role that was given to them by said society. You could say that's because I'm still at least partially masculine, it's just that now I'm recognizing my feminine side. And as such, I empathize with the young men who felt like they were treated unfairly, and even those who fell down the pipeline. Having dipped my toes in out of frustration with progressive activists and how they talk about young men. But I'm both aro-aspec and trans non-binary, and I understand the struggles of being a part of said groups. So I felt like I had to at least try and reach out to both sides and help them understand each other with whatever I can offer by sharing my experience. So if you're a progressive who has made it this far, all I have to say to you is this. Try to understand the young men who have fallen in with the wrong crowd. Not necessarily to empathize with them, but to understand what motivated them to take the plunge. Politics and the algorithms have led to a lot of polarization and division, but understanding is the first step to bridging the divide. If what I've said here has given you a new perspective, maybe consider checking out my Star Wars video if you haven't already for a more in-depth look at the controversy that almost radicalized me. If you want more, a ton of other YouTubers have made videos about this. Sean has a video diving into the mindset of these sorts of people made several years ago. Dark Matter 2525 made a fantastic video about his fall into a similar situation as me and how he got out. Shanspear dives into the manosphere and a lot of problems with modern masculinity. FD Signifier created a career based on deconstructing the manosphere. And Pillar of Garbage has a whole series about the current grifters and how everything is far more connected than we realize at first. I don't watch all of their content, nor do I agree with everything they say, but these videos explain a lot of this issue from the perspective of people who either fell into a bad pipeline or those who studied it. And for any young men who don't really understand what progressives or people from marginalized groups are fighting for, try to find a member of said group who can explain things in a manner you can understand. Speaking as a member of the LGBTQ community, believe me when I say we love to share our experiences. Trans people like myself would love to share our experience with gender as a social phenomenon over just being surgeries and controversy to the public. And if you want advice about talking to girls, while I can't give you advice on getting a date, I can give you a bit of advice on how to start. Step 1. Always remember to be polite and respectful. Don't come across as too pushy. If she doesn't want to do something, don't press her. Step 2. Consider starting by talking about a common interest you both may have. That's just good advice in general for starting conversations as an introvert. Step 3. Just remember that women are people too, not nearly as different from yourself as you may think. They too have lives, hopes, struggles, and dreams. And if you've got something you want to pursue that is considered too girly for young men, just do it anyway. Do what makes you happy as long as you aren't hurting anyone, even if it makes you uncomfortable at first. It could be something that brings you a lot of joy. Even if you're cisgender, And if you've got a lot of pent-up feelings that society has told you to just suck up, don't. Take it from someone with anxiety, depression, and ADHD. Never bottle up or repress your feelings. The outcome is not pretty. Acknowledge and understand your feelings, and maybe get help from someone. Maybe a friend or a family member, maybe a professional if you really need it. But for now, that's all for me. This video is very different from what I usually make, so please let me know what you thought about it in the comments below. I'd love to hear from a different perspective regarding this topic. And thank you so much for watching this long. I'm Kylan Mythos, and I'll see you all next time.